She tightened the last stitch on the cracked saddle and kept her face pointed at the leather instead of the crowd collecting outside the courthouse. Mirren Hollis knew the bell would ring twice and then Mr. Tolland would climb the steps and read names from his list as if he were calling cattle to the rail. She knew this because it happened every year, June after the first hay, right there in Prospect Hollow, a ritual dressed up as a picnic where men pinned tokens to bonnets and futures were decided with sugar cookies and careful smiles. Today, the bell rang a third time. Unprecedented interest, Tolland announced, voice syruped with cheer and debt. Ranch season's been good. Plenty o' men looking to settle respectable. Mirren set down the awl, flexed her stiff hands, and wiped them on her apron. She told herself she preferred the quiet of the repair bench, the smell of oil and horsehair, to whatever performance was happening outside. But the bench sat under the open doors of her little shop and the square was a stage you couldn't ignore. She could hear the laughter rolling over dust, the bright clack of dominoes at Haskell's tables, the church ladies corralling children, the creak of new boots on New Hope. Her name would be last. It always was. The bell quit, and for a moment there was only wind nudging the courthouse bunting. Then Tolland began reading, and ribbons were claimed. Mirren went on working because working gave her something to do with her mouth besides swallow humiliation. She'd sanded and stitched and hammered all morning. She had mended farmer straps for a quarter, relaced a bridle for Widow Farrell at no charge, and kept pretending she didn't hear the talk, that Mirren Hollis was bad luck, that at 26 she'd outweighted good sense, that she had debts like rain barrels and a father with a memory people would rather forget. She reached for the beeswax. Her hand trembled, just a little. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The courthouse doors banged open. Boys poured out to report the news like town crows. Names, tokens, laughter. A few kind-hearted girls drifted by Mirren's shop door, glancing in with the same expression folks saved for injured foals and burned biscuits. She smiled for them. She had learned to do that. She's a fine worker, old Mr. Haskell said to no one, dealing himself a patient's hand in the shade. Deserves a fair turn. Fair ain't how it goes, Deputy Rook answered, lounging on the porch rail with a toothpick he worried like a grudge. Besides, men want quiet women and soft hands. Not a woman with all scars and opinions. Mirren finished the stitch and tied it off. My hands are quieter than your mouth, Deputy, she said, not looking up. The boys snickered. Rook flushed dark and grinned like a dog showing teeth. You'll be glad enough for a lawman when the notices post, he said. Tolland's been patient. That patience is gone. She glanced up then. Rook's gray shirt showed sweat circles the size of biscuits. His tin star crooked on his chest. Behind him, the token board stood under the cottonwoods, a square of painted wood with names written in flourishes and circled in chalk. A cluster of men were still gathered there, consulting, conferring. A few wives hovered with folded arms. Tolland's voice carried again, and lastly, the name of Miss Mirren Hollis. The hush that followed was a kind of mercy in reverse. Mirren didn't turn her head. She kept arranging tools on the bench with needless precision and pretended not to hear the measured scrape of chalk on wood, the circle around nothing. No tokens, Tolland declared. The board closes at sundown. He said it like a verdict he enjoyed. Mirren lifted the saddle to the rack. That'll hold 6 seasons, she told herself, lightheaded with the effort it took to keep that even tone in her own head. That stitch line is straight. That's worth something. Afternoon, Mirren, Mrs. Avila said, pausing in her walk home with a basket of bread. She was one of the church women whose kindness had bones. I could use 2 girth straps next week. I'll pay up front. I'll start 'em tomorrow, Mirren said, and when Mrs. Avila squeezed her forearm with farmer-strong fingers, Mirren nearly wept. Not from sorrow exactly. From how far gentleness had to walk to reach her. She lasted in the doorway until the square thinned. Then she swept. She swept for a long time, though there wasn't much dust. She swept because it was something the last choice could do that the first choices didn't have to, tidy up after other people's courage. The sun had started its drop behind North Mesa when the riders arrived. You knew the North Star outfit before you saw the brand on their flanks. They came with the sound of money moving, quiet tack, horses shod by a farrier who cared, men who didn't shout because they didn't need to. Prospect Hollow straightened without meaning to. Folks peered from window shadows. Mr. Haskell's card fell from his fingers. Even Deputy Rook took his toothpick out of his mouth. The tall man who dismounted first wasn't the biggest, but he had a way of taking measure with his eyes that made men set their shoulders. His coat was plain but cut right. His gloves were plain but butter soft. He took off his hat like a man who remembered to bother. "Afternoon," he said. The word was simple and clean. Someone whispered, "Cashin North. The wealthiest rancher from here to the Salt Flats. The man who held the water rights like a poker hand. The one who never came to town on a Sunday like this without needing something that mattered." Mirren's broom angled against the jam. She knew his name the way one knew the shape of the mesa or the winter path of geese. She also knew the stories, that he'd traded a railroad lawyer 3 sections of worthless scrub for a spring that never failed, that he paid his hands through drought and kept widows on the supply list when others cut them off, that he had never married, though women's mothers practiced his last name in mirror glass. Cashin North stepped into her doorway as if it were the doorway he had intended all along. "Mirren Hollis," he said, as if confirming the spelling of the sky. Deputy Rook shifted on the porch. "Mr. North," he began, eager to be important, "Tollins got the board up at the—" Cashin didn't so much look away from Rook as look more toward Mirren. It had the same effect. "Miss Hollis," he said, "may I speak plain?" "You may speak," she said before she could stop herself. Polite felt safer. Her heart, traitor, had started an odd beat under her apron, a hoof against fence boards. He glanced past her at the bench, at the saddle with its neat stitches, at the rows of tools. "You mend what other people break," he said. "You do it right." "Most days," she answered. "Some days it's not worth the price of the leather. Today is worth more than leather." He nodded toward the square. "I heard what happened at the board." "Everybody heard," she said. "Sounded like weather on tin." She tried to make it a joke. It rattled anyway. Something moved in his expression, anger, she thought, but not at her. "I'm not much for picnics," he said. "But I don't like to see a fair system used for unfair ends." "It's not a system," she said, before remembering who she spoke to. "It's a chalk trick so men can feel brave while they ask permission from a wall." A corner of his mouth acknowledged that. "I've come to ask permission from you." The broom bristles pressed grooves into her palm. "For what?" "For courtship," he said, and a hum went through the street like a plucked wire. "For marriage, if you'll have me after you've seen the parts of me I don't bring to town." He said it so plainly it almost sounded like a business arrangement until he added, quieter, "above all others." Her name on Tollins' empty board burned behind her eyes, absurd and living. Mirren stood very still. It would have been easy to lean into the quiet that followed and mistake his certainty for fate. She had made promises to herself on worse days than this. She had said she would not trade one cage for another just because the paint was better. "I have debts," she said carefully. "A shop that don't always carry itself. A father buried without honors." "Folks who?" "I know what folks say," Cashin said. "I know some of it's true. I know none of it's your measure. You don't know me. I know you returned a double eagle last fall when Mr. Haskell overcounted his pot," he said. "I know you patched a Mexican vaquero's saddle for free because Tollins said he had no credit." He tipped his head. "I know you went into the ditch in February to pull a calf with your arms when most men stayed on horseback and gave advice." Her throat tightened. "Who told you that?" "The man you saved the calf for," he said. "He works my south herd. He don't tear easy. He said you didn't tear either." Mirren's lips parted around a dozen sentences at once and chose none of them. He waited. That startled her more than anything. Men didn't wait when they wanted something. They crowded. Out on the porch, Deputy Rook hefted his boot and rapped it against the rail. "Miss Hollis is under notice," he said. "Her payments are late. Tolland's got papers." Cash and North's eyes flicked once toward Rook, and Mirren watched the deputy's voice curdle to silence. Not from threat. From a man unaccustomed to being seen through. "What do you want from me?" Mirren asked. She pitched it flat, so the fear stayed inside the words, not on top. "To be allowed to show you my land and the way I hold it," he said. "To talk with you without a wall listening." He looked at her bench again. "To see if our daily work fits." "Fits," she echoed, because the word made something in her chest ease. "And if it doesn't?" "Then I pay Tolland tomorrow at noon and your shop stays yours," he said. "No strings. No talk. No whisper I can't bury." Mirren's grip on the broom eased. She didn't know yet if she believed him. But he had named the fear without flinching, the debt notice that would post in 3 days, her name in Tolland's precise hand under the word default. The shop was the only thing she owned outright besides her father's pocketknife. The shop was where she was most herself. The thought of it taken by a man who sold things he didn't make made her palms go cold. "Tomorrow," she said. "Because you can, or because you intend to hurry me?" "Because if I don't, Tolland will," he said. "And because I think the only fair way to ask a woman to decide is to make sure her choice isn't between a man and a cliff." She exhaled and tested the air like a horse that had nearly spooked. "What would you ask today?" "That you come up to the North Star for supper," he said. "No promises. 1 hour, and you may bring anyone you trust to listen and look." Mirren thought of the people she trusted, Mrs. Avila with her bread and her bones, Doc Brennan with his gruff hands, Mr. Haskell with his card tricks and soft eyes. She did not think of Deputy Rook. "You pick the hour," Cashin added. "You pick which room we sit in. You pick whether we speak in English or silence and who pours coffee. You're either the most dangerous man I've met or the most careful," she said. "I can't tell which." "Both," he said, and for the first time she believed the truth lived in him without dressing. "I'll come," she decided. "But I'll ride my own horse. And I'll leave if anyone talks like I've been purchased." "Agreed," he said, and stepped back so her shadow wasn't in his. "An hour after sundown suits?" "Suits," she said. Deputy Rook found his tongue. "You'd be smart to consider standing offers," he told Mirren. "A lawman's house is safe." Mirren set the broom aside and lifted her father's old hat from the peg. "So is a house with a roof," she said, "and yours leaks." The boys laughed. Rook's face closed like a door slammed in anger. Cashin North tipped his hat once to her and twice to Mrs. Avila, as if he understood something about where strength in this town actually dwelled. Then he was in the saddle again, the reins aligned from his hand to a horse that trusted him. The North Star men turned as a flock turns, smooth and unhurried, and headed out of town along the river road. "You be careful, Nina," Mrs. Avila murmured when the dust had settled. "Careful doesn't mean coward." "I know," Mirren said. It was good to hear it from someone else. She spent the hour before sundown the only way she knew how to steady herself, by working. She cut 2 straps for Mrs. Avila and 3 for a man who paid late but paid. She oiled the bench and set the awls in a coffee tin so they would not roll like coins. She left a note on the door, "Closed for supper. Back when I return." She saddled Finch, the roan she'd traded for the winter her father died, and took the river path because the road was a place where men humped like geese. The path was willow and water talk. It was also the fastest line to the North Star gate, and Mirren was not going to be late to her own judgment. At the river crossing, she paused to breathe. The cottonwoods held their breath with her. She fixed her hat and smoothed the braid that stuck like a stubborn sentence over her shoulder. She did not paint her mouth with berry. She wiped oil from her fingers onto her skirt and didn't bother to hide the stain it left. She was going to insist on being seen. The North Star spread along the far ridge like a story told with the economy of a man who disliked bragging. Fences in good repair but not fancy. A bunkhouse painted once and repainted where it mattered. A main house with wide porches that looked out over the work like a pair of eyes that truly looked. A windmill that turned without complaining. She saw men finishing up at the pens. Heard the soft ruff of cattle remarking on dinner. Smelled beans and onions in coffee. Her stomach, which had been a tight fist all day, announced itself. A woman met her on the porch. She was middle height and iron-haired and wore an apron and a revolver the way some women wore a wedding ring, easy, daily, non-negotiable. "You're Mirren," she said, and her voice was salt and cornbread. "Yes. I'm Lark," the woman said. "I run the house and the kitchen and some of the men when they're in the mood to be run. I also raised Cashin from knee-high, so if you've got questions he won't answer plain, you ask me." Mirren startled. "He said I could bring someone I trust," she said. "I didn't bring anyone but myself." "Good," Lark said. "Because you'll need both your hands free." She glanced at the roan. "Horse'll be tended. You want coffee now or after you've seen what he wanted you to see?" "After," Mirren said, which must have been the right answer because Lark's mouth tipped once before she stepped aside. Cashin waited in the wide room off the porch that faced the pens. He stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and his hat on the sill. The room was plain and clean. A long table. Chairs that matched because someone kept oil on the wood. A map of the range with little wire flags stuck into it like sewing pins. Against the far wall, a shelf with worn books, irrigation, Spanish poems, a ledger written in a tidy slanted hand. "You came," he said, as if that had been his question all along. "I did." She let her eyes move. Not fast. Enough to count exits and corners, the way one did without doing it. He saw the counting and didn't pretend not to. "There's a thing I'd like you to watch," he said, tipping his chin toward the window. "It's how we start and end most days." Mirren moved to stand beside him. Below the porch, 4 men worked a line of cattle through a chute. 1 man checked brands, 2 vaccinated, 1 opened and closed the gate. Nobody hollered. Nobody hit. It was movements like music. The cattle never balled up because hands and gates were where they said they'd be at the moment they needed to be there. "You don't fight them," she said quietly. "You argue with their fear until it makes sense to them to walk." "Fear is a language," Cashin said. "Same as numbers, same as rain." She nodded. "My father didn't believe that." "I know," Cashin said. He didn't move or look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the necks pressing past the vaccinator, the long patient resignation of animals and men. He believed force made the world tidy. "He believed force made men respect you," she said, and dust in her throat tried to make the words cough. She swallowed it down. "He died with men who respected him and none who loved him." Cashin's hand shifted in his pocket. "Do you think a person can change what they inherited, Mirren?" "I think you can choose," she said. "You still end up paying for other people's choices. But you can stop adding interest." He smiled with his eyes, not his mouth. "Come eat," he said. "Then I'll say the parts Lark told me are the only parts that count." Supper was beans and cornbread and greens with vinegar and beef that had been kissed by smoke for a half day. Men came to the porch one by one and sat on the steps. Nobody stared long. They looked the way men looked when a piece of weather drifted in and might be rain and might be nothing, the respectful kind of curious. Lark poured coffee that could have spooked mules and placed a small plate of quince preserves by Mirren's elbow without comment. Mirren ate slowly, grateful for the way the table gave her hands something to do while her thoughts tried to arrange themselves into honest questions. "Who keeps the books?" she asked at last, nodding to the ledger on the shelf. "I do," Cashin said. "Lark reads every line." "You ever lose a calf and call it found?" "Not once," he said. "I mark losses." "Men who won't mark losses lose everything." "Men who won't mark losses," she repeated softly, thinking of her father's face the day the bank took the last mule. How he'd rather blame thunder than the way he'd tied a knot. "How many men you fired this year?" "3, Cashin said. 2 for drinking on duty." one for putting his hands where they weren't invited. That made Marin's heart perform that strange hoof beat again. She let it thrill, then end. "What do you want in a marriage?" she said. "If I say yes." "I want mornings where we speak plain," he said, "and nights where work isn't the only thing we know how to hold. I want a woman who disagrees and stays at the table. I want hands at my maps that know leather and math. I want someone who can look at me and say if the way I made my money hurt a man it didn't have to hurt." He cleared his throat, not liking speeches. "I want to be chosen as the man I am, not because I can pay Talland." "And what do you give?" Her voice had a rasp in it now. It embarrassed her and she let it be. "I give the land I owe to," he said. "A name that won't flinch when it's spoken. My temper, when it rises, checked at the door. Half the ledgers and all of the porch looking west in April." He waited. "And if the person I ask says no, I give her back her hours in her shop with the roof mended." "It leaks?" she asked, surprised into a laugh. "It will," Lark called from the doorway, as if roofs were weather you could bet on. "Wind shifted this spring." Mirren cupped her coffee. "You're too careful," she said. "Careful men have sharp edges that cut you when you lean." "Then don't lean until you want to," Cashin said, and the gentle in it shook her more than any charm would have. A horse stamped in the yard, Finch, recognizing his feed bucket or objecting to being so near the North Star scent. Mirren set down her cup. "I need to see something," she said. "Not the house. Your water." Cashin stood. "Saddle Pond or Head Gate?" "Head Gate," she said. "Where force pretends to be choice." He led. She followed with Lark's lantern swinging at her side. Men parted for them as if they were something they hadn't quite understood yet. The air cooled into that silver hour where colors soften and edges don't. They crossed the yard and took a path through rabbit brush that smelled like Sun's last pocket. The head gate crouched over the river like a stubborn uncle. Water spoke in several languages at once, the steady throat song of the main flow, the chatter where it met iron, the hush where it slid into ditch. Cashin handed her the lantern. "There's a trick to the wheel," he said. "A notch that lets you turn what looks too heavy with 2 fingers if you're patient." Mirren bent and found the notch by listening to where the water sounded less angry. She set her fingers and waited for the wheel to move toward her hand the way a skittish horse will if you stand where it decides to stand. The wheel gave. The gate lifted. The ditch sighed with pleasure. "How many men know that notch?" she asked. "All of them," he said. "Because if I don't get home, I want the water to." "Why tell me?" "Because you asked about force," he said. "Because if you say yes, you'll run this with me. Because if you say no, I want my water handled by the person in this county most likely to respect something that won't be bullied." She straightened slowly, the lantern painting both their faces in a way that hid nothing. "You don't scare me," she said. "Not because you couldn't. Because you don't want to." "I know how to be feared," he said. "It's a tool like any other. I don't use it in my house." "Use it on Talland," she said softly, testing a different part of him. "I use the law on Talland," he said. "Fear makes men sloppy. Paper makes them move. Paper made my father mean," she said. "He lost his mules to paper and blamed the wind." "Paper's a tool too," he said. "I would show you which ones do what." "Say I say yes," she said. "Say we do this thing." She didn't let her voice tremble on marriage. "What happens when the work is heavy? When the men grumble because a woman set the head gate too low and the ditch runs slow?" "Then the men give me their grumbles," he said. "And I give them supper and tell them where the water goes. And if they don't like it, they ride somewhere else." Her eyes stung. She wasn't sure why. "It would be loud," she said. "In my head." "Let it be loud," he answered. "I'm not afraid of loud." They stood there while the ditch carried a little moon in its ribbon. She didn't mistake the stillness for romance. She let it be what it was, 2 people considering a fence they might build and deciding if the corner posts matched. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," she said finally. "After I sleep in my own house one more night." He inclined his head. Then I'll see you at noon, he said. Either way. Lark walked her back to the porch. You eat enough? The older woman asked. Enough, Mirren said. You saw enough? I saw the head gate. Mirren didn't realize how tired she was until she said it. As if those 4 words had been holding up her spine. Lark adjusted the lantern on its hook. Cashin's good, she said, as if discussing the weather in a year that needed good weather. Not soft. Sometimes that's worse. He needs somebody who won't let his careful turn into cold. Do I look like warm to you? Mirren asked, a rueful little sound in it. You look like a woman who keeps the fire from going out, Lark said. That's different. She squeezed Mirren's hand once, as if fastening a button, and left her to her horse and her thoughts. Prospect Hollow looked smaller at night, as if shame took up more room in daylight and gave some back after dark. Mirren rode past the courthouse where the bunting hung limp and the chalkboard leaned its face into the wall like a scolded child. She dismounted in front of her shop and let Finch blow gratitude into her palm. She locked the door because Rook had a habit of wandering. Then she lit her lamp and sat at the bench with the ledger she hated most, the one with Tollin's numbers. She added the figures again, though she knew them by heart. She wrote them on a scrap and turned the scrap over and wrote them on the other side. They came out the same. They always did. She drew a line under them and wrote a word she did not write often because it invited Hope to sit down in a room she couldn't heat, possible. Then she slept in the cot in the back room in her clothes, because if she got fully undressed, she might lose the nerve to keep owning herself. Morning came with the smell of bread. Mrs. Avila had left a loaf on the stoop wrapped in a flour sack and tied with string. Under the bread was a note, say yes if yes. Say no if no. Don't say maybe to save a man from feeling small, Mirren ate a slice while it was still warm. She mended the Widow Farrell's second harness strap and took the package to the quiet house where curtains never flapped. Widow Farrell paid in coins that had a history. She held Mirren's hand longer than the price required. By mid-morning, the town was busy with the way summer days hurry to be used. Children ran with sticks pretending the sticks were horses. Mr. Haskell rolled barrels from the delivery wagon with more confidence than his age warranted. Doc Brennan yelled at a boy for climbing a fence like a cat. Tollin stood under the cottonwoods with 2 men in suits, making handshapes at the air that meant after fee. Deputy Rook was on the boardwalk outside the jail, his boots indeed damp from the leak in his roof she had teased him about. He tipped his hat, a gesture he intended as gallant and which made her skin crawl. Noon, he said. Clock don't stop for anybody. Not even you, she said. Wouldn't want it to, he grinned. Time's a ladder to men who climb. Time's a flood to men who can't swim, she answered, and went inside her shop before her mouth said something her head would have to fight for. She put her hand on the saddle she'd finished yesterday and thought, I want to build rather than burn, she thought. I want stages of work that fit inside a day and also the kind that take a decade. She thought, I want to be chosen the way I choose myself, not because nobody else did, but because someone looked at the line of my stitches and said, that's the line I want in my house. At 11:50, she closed the door. At 11:55, she locked it. At 11:59, she stood in the street with the sun on the top of her ear and felt ridiculous for noticing something so small at such a moment. Cashin came from the North Road as if called by Math. He dismounted. He did not reach for her. He let his hands hang open at his sides where she could count them. I'll marry you, she said, because if she waited any longer her courage might scatter. I'll marry you if we put it on paper that the shop stays mine. I'll marry you if we write it plain that the head gate is half mine and the ledgers too. I'll marry you if you swear to tell me when you're afraid of becoming your money. She didn't look away as she said the last part. He ought to hear it from a face, not a shoulder. Yes, he said, and the word had a sound that made people on the far side of the street turn and listen. Yes to all of it. Then we'll write it, she said. With Lark and Doc Brennan in the room. We'll write it, he said, and something that had been wound tight inside her since she was 15 and learned what her father's signature cost a person, something inside her uncoiled and sat down, breathing like a horse after a hard run. They didn't kiss. They shook hands. Somewhere, boys would laugh about that. Mirren didn't care. In a life where men took without asking and women learned to barter with their small safety, the feel of his hand meeting hers in front of the whole town was the start she wanted, a choice, a contract, a steadiness. "Hold," Talon said, appearing with his ledger and his particulars as if conjured by paper cuts. "There's a matter of lien." He flourished a document. "The Hollis shop is attached to outstanding sums. No marriage shall prejudice the bank's right." He smiled, but it was all tooth. "Deputy?" Rook stepped forward, the tin star bright as a wet fish. "Law says a woman's property goes to her husband unless otherwise stipulated." He looked Cashin up and down, and his envy wasn't even trying to be modest. "You'd agree to such otherwise?" "I just did," Cashin said. "And if you bring that paper into Lark's kitchen, she'll wipe beans with it." Talon's smile thinned. "Fine statements," he said. "They won't hold in court." He lifted his chin to Mirren. "You have 3 days before default. Marriage doesn't wash it. Your best hope is a husband with ready funds and little patience for your terms." "I've got both," Cashin said. "Funds and patience. And I carry both longer than you do." "We will see," Talon murmured, and moved off the way spiders move when you've broken their web but not their pride. The square breathed again. Someone cheered weakly. Mrs. Avila cried openly and wiped her face with the heel of her hand. Mr. Haskell threw his hat in the air and forgot why it was up there 10 seconds later. Doc Brennan came out of his office and said, "Well then," like somebody who had waited a long time to say well then about something that wasn't a wound. Lark appeared with 2 cups. "Drink," she said. "Then come right before the day gets ideas." They wrote. The kitchen smelled like onions and iron and new pencil. Lark set the terms as if she were mending a sleeve that would be pulled on hard, seams doubled where life would strain them. Doc Brennan read the words out loud and made them stop when the sentences ran away from breath. Mirren signed. Cashin signed. Lark made her mark like a slash that said "I was here." Doc signed with his full name like he always did. "Bless you children," Lark said, which came out sounding to Mirren like, "Now work." They walked back to the porch. The sky had turned hot brass. Prospect Hollow was gearing up for the afternoon's habit of pretending it was too busy to gossip while it was gossiping. Deputy Rook stood near the street with a narrowed gaze and a smile that had scratched itself onto his mouth with a nail. Talon lingered under the cottonwoods with the 2 suited men who looked like traveling accountants and smelled like smog. "Someone's going to test you," Lark murmured, too low for anyone but Mirren to hear. "Men don't like systems they don't own. Men like Rook don't like women who won't choose them when choosing is about safety," Mirren said. The precision of it startled her and steadied her in the same instant. "Go back to your shop," Lark said. "Work the hours that make you yourself. Cashin will handle the men who need handling." "I'll handle a few," Mirren said, because it tasted good to say it. "Good," Lark said, and handed her a packet wrapped in cloth. "This is the head gate key. Fits the notch if your fingers forget where the listening is." Mirren tucked the packet into her skirt pocket and touched it once. Possible, she thought again, and the word didn't feel like an intruder anymore. It felt like a chair pulled out for her at her own table. It changed nothing and everything, the handshake and the paper. The afternoon moved along with the same noises and most of the same meanness, but the light slanted differently on things that had always been there. Women nodded at Mirren in a way that made room in their eyes. Men paused before speaking to her, recalculating the cost of each word. She put her apron back on. She mended Mr. Haskell's strap and gave him a discount he pretended not to notice. She measured a boy's belt and cut it longer than he asked because boys asked for less than they needed if they were embarrassed. She turned away men who spoke to her like a list. She sold 2 saddle soaps and a pair of spur straps and a brass buckle and a small tin of oil to a man who couldn't pronounce castor. At dusk, Cashin came by the shop and leaned in the doorway, hat in his hands like a person who got taught early to take off his hat inside. He didn't step over the threshold. She liked him a little for that. "Dinner's on the porch," he said. "I'll come later," she answered. "I've got 2 more orders to finish and a ledger to write in with my name on it." He nodded. "I'll leave lark stew," he said. "Don't let it think it beat you." "Nothing beats me that comes in a pot," she said. "No," he agreed, eyes flicking with quiet humor to the deputy across the street who still watched the shop the way coyotes watch chicken wire. "But some things come with badges." He sobered. "Lock your door." "I always do," she said. "I also keep my hammer where a hand can find it." He started to say more, then didn't. He touched the brim of his hat the way a man salutes work he respects and crossed back to his horse. "North," Deputy Rook called, making Cashin pause. Here the hollow got itself a queen. Cashin swung into the saddle. "What it got," he said mildly, "is a woman who'll make this place honest if it kills it." Rook laughed like a fence nail pulled with bad pliers. "You'll regret marrying trouble." "I regret only not marrying her yesterday," Cashin said, and rode into evening without even giving the deputy his back. Mirren worked until the light thinned itself into ribbons and the flame in her lamp became the way a room knows itself. She finished the straps. She wrote numbers in her ledger that had to do with her work and not with Talon's idea of fate. She cleaned her awls and set them with the points covered so they wouldn't bite her when she was reaching for something else. She ate lark stew with a spoon that had her father's nicks on the handle and cried once into the steam without knowing which part of all this had finally demanded tears as its wage. When the banging started, she thought first that it was a door blown by wind. Then she remembered the wind wasn't scheduled. Then she recognized the sound of men who wanted to be a storm. She set down the spoon and took the hammer. She stepped to the front door and said, "Who's there?" because that was what her mother had taught her to say, even to danger. "Open up, Miss Hollis," Deputy Rook said, amiable as sour milk. "Routine inspection." She slid the bolt but didn't open. "For what routine?" "Shop safety," he said. "We've had a rash of fires." "You keep lamp oil near rags?" "I keep common sense near rags," she said. "Go home, deputy." "Law," he drawled, tapping the tin star, "don't go home." "I know," she said, "and I'd the back door in her head the way you do when you plan both kindness and retreat. Law takes its boots off in my shop anyway." He laughed harder than the joke deserved. "You'll find, Mrs. North," he said, rolling the word like a mouthful of greed, "that marriage won't keep you safe from how town works." "I'll find," she said, heartbeat steady, "that my marriage kept me from being your problem to solve." "Open the door," he snapped, and the temper under his charm finally showed up. "No." She stood and listened to him breathe hard through his nose and knew he was imagining what it would take to break the hinge. Men like Rook saved their rage for when they felt small and cornered. 3 days, he said at last, his voice rusted thin. "Then we'll see where paper belongs." His boots moved away. Another set stayed a heartbeat too long and then followed, and Mirren understood that Rook had brought the kind of company that didn't wear badges. She waited until silence had weight again. Then she blew out the lamp and stood with her hammer in the dark for a long time, counting. When counting stopped working, she lay down on the cot with the hammer on her chest and listened to the building settle. She had almost convinced herself her fear was theatrical when she smelled it, a sweetness you only smelled once before in a town and never forgot after, accelerant. She was on her feet before she had a plan. The back wall popped like a knuckle. Heat lit the seam between boards. Smoke slid along the ceiling with purpose. Mirren ran to the door. It opened and a fist of heat hit her in the face because the outside air fed the greed inside. She stumbled back. The oil lamp she had set carefully out of any sane draft exploded in a sudden gust and threw a curtain of flame across the counter. The fire wasn't an accident. It behaved like something that had been told where to start. She grabbed the water bucket and learned what everyone learns: water is a sermon the first time and a whisper the second. She threw it anyway, because throwing is what you do when your whole life is wood. She yanked the tarp from the corner and slapped at the flames and moved like somebody fighting an animal that wasn't going to stop until it ate the room. The back door wouldn't open. Warped. Or wedged. She didn't say a prayer. She said a word her father had said to mules when they sat down on a hill. Then she put her shoulder into the door and put her voice into her shoulder and felt the panel give like a stubborn argument. Outside, the alley was a tube of smoke. She dropped to her knees because smoke is cruel to tall people first and crawled into air that seemed to have been borrowed from an old barrel. She coughed until her eyes watered and wiped them with the heel of her hand, leaving a black line on her skin like a new lifeline she hadn't intended. "Help!" someone shouted from somewhere she couldn't see. "Mirren!" She scrambled to her feet. "Where?" The voice came thin now. "Here, by the coop, my boy." Mirren moved toward the sound. The coop was a rectangle of sticks and hope behind Mrs. Avila's house. The straw inside had caught. Flames licked the slats like the tongues of mean dogs. Mrs. Avila's youngest, Tomas, stood outside the fence, screaming and pulling at a wire loop that had twisted on itself. Inside, a goat bleated in terror. Mirren dropped the hammer, grabbed the wire with both hands, and wrenched. The blister that formed on her palm would hurt later. It had no vote now. The loop gave. She flung the gate open. The goat burst past her and knocked her sideways. She laughed once, absurd, and then saw the second shape inside, a lamb, too stiff with fear to move. "Mirren," someone shouted again, and this time it was a voice she knew without having to name it. "Cashin." "Here," she yelled back, and none of the smoke stole the sound from her. "With Tomas." Cashin appeared in the alley as if he had stepped out of the wall. Lark was with him, hair braided tight and eyes hard as a skillet. Behind them, men from the bunkhouse and Mr. Haskell and Doc Brennan and 3 boys with coffee buckets. People move when the right person yells move. "Back door," Mirren coughed. "Wedge it open." "My ledger." "Later," Cashin said, and the word didn't dismiss her work. It put it on a chair and promised to come back. He threw his coat over her shoulders because heat sees the person without a coat first. "We've got to keep the neighbors from catching." Lark was already there. She slapped a wet blanket against Mrs. Avila's back fence and screamed at boys and men by name until the line from the well to the alley ran like a thread that sewed the town together instead of letting it rip. "Rook," Mr. Haskell panted, "came through not 5 minutes ago with 2 men. Said he was inspecting. Then I smelled." He coughed black and couldn't finish. Cashin's jaw clenched. "Later," he said again, and this time the promise in it had iron on the edges. He turned to Mirren. "Can you breathe?" "Enough," she said. "Tomas?" She looked for the boy and found him kneeling with his face near the ground the way clever children do and saw his mother's hands on his shoulders like prayer clamps. The shop roof groaned. It sounded like a man who had picked up more than his share for too long. "Get back," Cashin barked, and men obeyed because he said it like someone who knew where the next board would fall. He grabbed Mirren's arm and yanked her into the alley with the speed that belongs to men who have seen walls do this thing before. The roof went down in a shower of sparks that turned the alley day bright. The heat punched their faces. Lark cursed a word in Spanish that sounded like live said hard. The flames chewed through rafters and then hesitated, thinking about jumping to Mrs. Avila's eaves. Lark threw one more wet blanket and broke their thought. Men on the roof of the bakery passed buckets to each other as if they had always been waiting to do this together. They won the street. That miracle would only show up in the way people walked tomorrow, shoulders not smoldering. The shop was gone. It collapsed inward like a chest at last breath. Mirren watched without sound the way people watch when something inside them that was old and difficult dies in public. "I'm sorry," Cashin said. He didn't touch her. He just put the word where she could hear it and not have to carry it too. "It was wood," she said hoarsely. "Wood and tools. I can make those again." Her eyes filled and spilled anyway. "Ledger. I know where Talon keeps copies," Lark said. "And I know where he keeps things he isn't supposed to keep. We'll take what's ours." Mirren blinked hard, trying to clear the smoke and the fact of her loss. He did this, she whispered. She didn't mean Talon only. She meant the man who smiled with a badge and thought that was the same as permission. Cashin's eyes were night at the edge of a canyon. We'll prove it, he said. Not with an accusation. With paper. Something in the wreckage hissed and popped. Sparks whirled up like bad laws. Everybody all right? Doc Brennan shouted down the alley. Anybody breathe too much? Fine, Mirren said, though the words scraped her throat. Tomas? Fine, Mrs. Avila answered, fierce and full. My boy is fine because you put your hands on my fence like a saint and a mule. Mirren laughed once, and it turned into a cough, and she leaned against the remaining sliver of her back door because her legs decided to have their opinion now that the work was done. Sit, Cashin said. He squatted in front of her so she didn't have to look up. Breathe slow. She obeyed. His face was smudged with ash. A little cut had opened along his cheekbone where something had nicked him. He hadn't noticed. Lark's lantern made a circle around them that felt like a room. In it, Mirren saw how the next days would go: smoke, paper, men who didn't like losing, a town deciding how it wanted to remember itself. She let the picture settle. Tomorrow, she rasped. We go to Talon's. With paper. With document. Before he hears himself into a better lie. We go at dawn, Cashin said. When men like that haven't had time to put their faces on. Lark straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and faced the alley mouth where a darker shadow had appeared, a man-shaped shadow that did not belong to anyone who had carried water. He held still in the way men hold still when they want to be mistaken for fences. He lifted something, and even through the smoke Mirren knew the silhouette of a rifle like she knew the shape of her own awl. Cashin, she said, not loud, because loud makes bullets hurry. He turned his head just enough. Their eyes crossed like two lines on a map. The rifle barked. Mirren's world narrowed to the size of the lantern's flame, and the white burst of pain that lit Cashin's shoulder as the shot took him and threw him backward into her arms. She screamed, but the scream didn't fix anything. The shooter shifted in the alley's throat for a second shot. Lark lunged, the lantern swinging in her hand like a small sun at the end of a chain. The glass shattered and became a shout of sparks and dark. Men were moving. Boys were yelling. Someone, Mrs. Avila, threw a pot the size of salvation into the alley where the shooter stood. The rifle lifted again, steadying on the ghost of a doorway. And that is exactly where everything stopped, Mirren with Cashin's blood hot across her forearm, the shooter's muzzle finding its punctuation, the town holding one huge, trying not to die breath, as the second bullet broke the dark and hunted for a heart. Hunted for a heart. The second shot struck stone and splintered it into the air beside Mirren's ear. She felt the bite of grit, the small hot kisses of rock on skin, and tasted lime dust like a reprimand. Cashin's weight sagged, then rallied hard against her as he tried to get forward in spite of the hole burning through his shoulder. Lark had already moved. She snatched the iron hook that hung by Mrs. Avila's wash line and flung it low. The shadow at the alley mouth jerked, stumbled, caught itself, and the rifle's muzzle snagged just enough that the third shot went off wild, spitting a spark into the night sky instead of into someone's ribs. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Down! Mirren shouted, and dropped with Cashin as if the ground itself had grabbed the back of her collar. Two of the North Star hands, Bren and Caleb, hit the alley running. Bren didn't bother to draw, he came in like a man who'd put both fists to good use before there were pistols in his pockets. The shooter fired once more, panicked now, the shot high and left like a lie told in a hurry, and then the dark shape scattered backward into deeper dark. Leave him, Lark barked at the men who would have followed. Hold the line. Get buckets on that far eve. Doc, I need your hands. Doc Brennan slid beside Mirren as if the years had trained his knees for cobbles and sudden blood. Pressure, he said. Here. No, there. Good. You hold, I'll tie. He tore his own shirt into a strip and looped it under Cashin's arm, teeth bared with the concentration of a man who refused to let death pick and choose without a fight. Cashin breathed like a bellows with a broken rib. He found Mirren's eyes because there was nowhere else that wasn't smoke. "I'm here," she said, steady as she could make it. "You're here." "Ledger," he rasped. "Tomorrow, Tolland." "Tomorrow," she said. "Your job is now." Sirens did not live in Prospect Hollow, but there's a way a town sounds when people have decided not to let something end. That sound grew. Buckets passed, hands blurred, orders landed and were obeyed. Mirren smelled hair singe and watched spark ash fall like black snow around Mr. Haskell's hat as he ferried water and forgot for once to be old. They could not save the shop. They did save everything it might have turned into a grave for. "Move," Doc grunted. "Caleb, take his legs. Mirren, you stay with the pressure. Lark, clear us a path." He lifted his chin at the murk that had been the back door. "Office, not bunkhouse. Too many men means too many opinions. I need my tables and light." They carried Cashin through a smoke tunnel and out into night that finally admitted it could be gentle. The stars above the alley had the pale, stunned look stars get when they have watched a fire and decided not to look away. Mrs. Avila crossed herself and then used the same hand to swipe at tears. "I'll watch Tomas," she said to Mirren, trying to put the promise somewhere it could help. "We'll sweep after." "Thank you," Mirren whispered, and then they were moving again. Doc Brennan's office smelled like carbolic, coffee, metal, and old books. The lamplight was surgical one minute and kindly the next, depending on which way it glanced off glass and spoon. "Out," he told everyone but Lark and Mirren. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "North, lay still or I'll tie you to this table with my suspenders." Cashin made a noise that translated to a willingness to be tied if it came to that. Mirren's hands held pressure the way hands hold reins when a horse goes foolish, not panicked, not tender, a wordless insistence that life stay in the correct lane. She watched the wound like it was a sentence she had to read without looking away. Doc irrigated. He cut shirt and cloth into cents. He explored with fingers so careful they might have been reading Braille. "Through and through," he said finally, and Mirren's lungs remembered they were in the room. "Hi. Missed the artery. Missed the bone. Close enough to smell both." He looked at Cashin. "You'll behave for me?" Cashin's mouth jumped at one corner. "I obey women," he said, voice so thin it made Mirren want to steady the air. "Ask anyone." Lark snorted. "He obeys me because he likes my stew and fears my spoon." Doc threaded needle, blinked, threaded again, then handed the job to Lark, whose eyes did not shake. "You sew," Doc said. "I'll set the compress and talk to him so he thinks I'm useful." "Talk to me," Mirren murmured, aware of how her fingers had begun to go numb from their task and aware too that if she let go too early she would dream about it for 20 years. "Tell me a story that broke and then was repaired." "Man came in with a hand he tried to fix with hog lard in a prayer," Doc said. "I washed him and cut the rot and told him the truth. He forgave me when it hurt him and loved me when it made him mad. 10 fingers later he could hold his child fine." "That wasn't a story," Mirren said. "It was the only kind that holds," Doc returned. "Work that did what it said it would." He nodded to her hands. "That's what you do." Lark's stitches were neat, decisive. Mirren watched thread meet skin and thought of the head gate, how water looks like power and is mostly patience. Cashin's jaw flexed once. He did not make a sound. "Good," Doc said eventually, dropping his shoulders as if the table had been a yoke across them. "He'll keep his blood. He'll keep his arm. He'll keep that mouth of his, God help us." He looked at Mirren. "Now you breathe." She did, and only then felt how the world at the edges had been going gauzy. "I'm fine," she lied, and then nearly laughed at herself because she had promised a life with less lying in it. Lark squeezed her shoulder. "You did what was needed," she said. "Now come wash and drink something that burns less than that alley." Mirren washed. The water in the basin turned a gray that looked like a long day turned tangible. The towel came away smudged and revealed a face that had remembered how to be one person in the middle of noise. "Sleep," Doc said to Cashin. "That's an order with my name under it. Mirren, if you can, go with Lark. There's going to be talk in the street. Talon will want to shape it while the embers are warm." "Let him try," Lark said, low and pleased at the prospect of being in the way of something unworthy. "We'll bring him a better shape to fold." Cashin's eyes had drifted half shut. He found Mirren anyway. "Dawn," he whispered. "Dawn," she promised, and the promise sat down between them like a chair pulled out and saving a spot. The night finished burning itself out. The town didn't sleep so much as change jobs, from bucket line to sweeping, from shouting to counting losses, from fear to anger cold enough to hold. Mirren spent 2 hours with Mrs. Avila sorting what little the fire had decided to make into gifts: 3 unburned awls at the back wall, a tin of brass buckles fused together into a disc that looked like a coin for a country no longer taking that currency, a single strap of leather, blackened and still soft if you cut the char away. She tucked the strap into her pocket like the headgate key, a second weight against her thigh that believed in being useful again. Deputy Rook took the corner by Haskell's with his usual air of having won something other people didn't realize was a contest. He tapped his badge and talked to anyone who would stand still long enough to be talked at. "Accident," she heard him say, and chose to stand still, not for him, but for the story. "Lamp oil and rags. Unfortunate, but the law don't see bad intention in spilled oil." "Funny," Mrs. Avila muttered, close enough for Mirren alone. "I smelled kerosene and regret." "Let him talk," Lark said when she and Mirren regrouped on the North Star porch 2 hours before daybreak. The air had the cold that comes just before new light. "He's packing the kindling under his own feet." "What do we have that isn't just rage?" Mirren asked, because she wanted to bring a ledger to a knife fight. "Paper," Lark said. "And people who can read it. I sent Caleb to wake Mr. Greeley, the notary, and Haskell to fetch Miss Page at the telegraph. Doc's taking statements from everyone who held a bucket and everyone who smelled what you smelled. I'll swear my own words and show my scorched apron. We'll send a wire to Judge Calder. He rode circuit here before Rook learned to tie his boots. He knows what this place smells like when it lies." "And Tolland?" Lark's mouth did a thing that looked like a smile if you were charitable. "Tolland keeps 2 ledgers," she said. "I kept his house 3 months after my sister died and I learned too much to keep a respectable job. He hides the second inside a wall of the back room behind a list of donors to the widow's fund that don't give what he writes down. The board looks away because he brings sandwiches to meetings and calls them charity. Men like that are boring and slippery until the light hits them right. Then they are bony as fish." Mirren felt the sudden sharpness of the night as if the stars had leaned in to hear. "Can we take it?" she asked. "Legally?" "We can take it into custody," Lark said, as if she'd rehearsed this argument at her stove. "With the notary present. With Miss Page writing the time. With Doc and Haskell and Mrs. Avila and 3 ranch hands and a dog if it helps. We don't sneak. We read the names out loud to the door when we go in so the door can tell the walls later how it happened." Mirren looked toward the sleeping bulk of Tolland's bank, a 2-story tidy lie with a fresh coat of paint. "Rook will be there." "Let him," Lark said. "If he wants a share of the stage, we'll make him read his lines into the book." Mirren breathed once, twice, as if the headgate wheel were under her palms. "Then I'm ready." "You're more than ready," Lark replied, and handed her a clean shirt. "You're dressed." Dawn poured into Prospect Hollow like something the night had been waiting to admit. Mirren walked to the bank with Lark, Doc Brennan, Mr. Greeley, Miss Page, Mr. Haskell, Caleb, Bren, and Mrs. Avila. Someone's dog came uninvited and was therefore perfect. People who had not slept lined the boardwalks and watched with the still, paying attention of those who have set their own stories down for a minute to watch someone else's matter. Tolland waited on the steps in a clean suit that fit him like a lie fits a practiced mouth. Deputy Rook stood at his shoulder with one hand on his belt and the other on his pride. "Open for business already?" Tolland said, making it sound like a compliment to himself that he would accommodate such early birds. "We do like commerce here." Mr. Greeley stepped forward with the weight of his thin seal in his thin hand. I am present as notary for a taking into custody of documents relevant to an act of arson that endangered lives and destroyed property. He said it as if he ordered flour. Miss Page, neat as a nail, poised her pencil. Preposterous, Rook said. You've no writ. You are one, Lark answered. And you witnessed the crime's smoke. You saw the men walk with purpose where there hadn't been any fire before. Your star either swears with us or tells us it was just decoration on your chest. A tremor moved through the watching crowd, the kind that is not laughter but is cousin to it. Tolland's smile tightened. You will not enter my bank without court order. We will enter the public lobby, Doc said. We will make statements. We will request you voluntarily produce the fire ledgers, those documenting oil and lamp purchases for your building and any you facilitated for tenants in town. I owe the town nothing, Tolland said. You owe it air, Mrs. Avila said softly. We watched our children breathe smoke. Rook's hand drifted toward the rifle leaning by the door. Lark looked at it, then at him, then back at the rifle like a woman looking at a broom and finding it an unhelpful object. You going to shoot the ledger? She asked. It bleeds numbers, deputy. Not much of a show. Without waiting for permission, she climbed the steps and stood beside Tolland. He moved to block the door. She moved closer. She said in a voice that other women could borrow later if they needed, open the door. In the end, it was not Tolland but the fact of the town watching that turned the knob. Miss Page said the time. Mr. Greeley stamped a line no one needed stamped but which would become useful later to men who only believed in things that ate ink. The lobby received them with the varnished politeness of places that are never entirely honest after noon. Tolland's clerk sat behind the counter and tried to decide whether to be brave for his employer or for himself. He settled on brave for the day. We're closed, he said weakly. We're open, Lark corrected, and leaned on the counter with an elbow that had kneaded dough enough to give it the right authority. Bring the building book. We don't keep one, Tolland snapped. Then we'll bring it, Lark said, and walked around the counter into the back as if kitchens and back rooms had long ago declared open borders for women like her. Rook moved to stop her. Mirren moved with him, a half-pace counter to his step, her body an argument prepared in advance. She said nothing. She let the alley smoke still on her clothes say it. Tolland's back room was a performance of order, safe with bright paint, cabinets labeled in a clerk's aspirational hand, a calendar already turned to next month as if time might grant grace for false preparation. Lark did not look at any of it. She looked at the wall where she had once hung her apron and counted boards from the corner, then counted again from the floor, then rapped with the butt of her palm the way one knocks on a door that remembers. Here, she said. Absolutely not, Tolland said. Mr. Greeley cleared his throat, and the sound had the novelty of a man with a quiet voice deciding to stand in front of it. As notary and citizen, he said, I request you permit inspection of fixtures for hidden spaces that may contain records material to a public endangerment. If you refuse, I will so note and send the note to Judge Calder. He will then count the note against you in the weighing and call it obstruction. Tolland's lips moved around the word obstruction as if it were a seed he had to spit. He stepped aside. Inspect, he said. But if you ruin so much as a hinge, I'll charge you personally. I'll pay with my ladle, Lark said, and slid her hand along the baseboard until it found what it had found years ago, a little nail that wasn't a nail but a pin. She pulled. The board lifted. Behind it, a second wall. Behind that, a space only a liar would call small. Lark reached in. So did Mirren. They removed 4 books bound in plain brown calf in a flat tin box that felt like it had kept secrets warm. She set them on the table, then faced the room like a pastor facing a congregation too fond of gossip. We won't open these in private, she said. Mr. Greeley, you call the pages. Miss Page, you write. Tolland, your eyes can be present. Your hands will not. Tolland spat a word that would have gotten him bounced from Mrs. Avila's porch and said, Rook. This is ridiculous, Rook began, and then saw something in the way the town had gathered in the doorway. Mrs. Avila's jaw, Haskell's clenched hands, the way Doc Brennan steadied himself with his knuckles on the table, and he swallowed the next word because he realized it would be recorded even if it was only spoken. Lark opened the tin. Receipts. Names. A paper that smelled like kerosene and had the store stamp from Weller's on the corner with a date from yesterday and 3 barrels noted where only one should have been sold to anyone. Read, Mirren said, and Mr. Greeley read. He read the names of men who had donated to the Widows' Fund in amounts they could not afford but somehow had. He read the names of debtors whose interest had grown twice as fast on Tollin's books as it did on paper in any town where a judge sometimes asked questions. He read Rook's name receiving a maintenance stipend from a fund that did not exist anywhere but this room. Fabrication, Tollin snapped. You brought those papers with you. Then call a handwriting man from the county seat, Doc Brennan said. Send for 3. We'll keep these here with the notary, no, with Miss Page at the Telegraph who is honest but not stupid, and let your experts work. Rook's face was doing arithmetic, and the sum kept refusing to be what he told it to be. You can't prove arson, he said anyway, because stubbornness wears a badge well. A receipt is not a flame. No, Mirren said, and drew a breath that put air in places the smoke had tried to keep. But Tomas can swear you were in the alley with 2 men 10 minutes before the fire took. Mrs. Avila can swear you told her she kept her oil wrong and pointed to a shelf that doesn't exist. Mr. Haskell can swear he heard you call my shop a hazard yesterday afternoon while you leaned under a tin sign you've been meaning to fix for 3 months and haven't. And I can swear, Lark added quietly, that you stood too long watching when the roof went and smiled once when you thought nobody with a spine could see you. The room heard it. It heard the part that was accusation and the part that was a town admitting it had looked away one time too many because it was easier to let certain men be themselves than to force them to be better. Enough, Tollin said. He reached for the ledgers as if by having them in his hands he could make time unhappen. Bren's hand was there faster, big and plain. He did not hit Tollin. He set his palm on the books and Tollin's hand stopped because Bren's wore more days of honest sun. We'll be taking a walk, Mr. Greeley said. Miss Page, seal what you've transcribed and carry the copies. Sheriff, oh wait. He looked at Rook without malice. Deputy. Walk with us. To where? Rook asked. Doc's office, Greeley replied. Where the town has spent a lot of mornings telling the truth. They filed out into the morning like a procession, a little bewildered to discover it was a procession. The street gave way for them. Above the roofs, the river whispered in its bed the way a thing with weight talks when it turns over in sleep. They did not get to Doc's front step. The first shouts came from the north road, the ones that mean water where water should not be. Men on the porch shaded their eyes with their hands and forgot they held the day's arguments. Miss Page lifted her head like a deer and began gathering papers on the run. Mirren didn't think. She just moved. Her hand found the headgate key in her pocket like a prayer she had been keeping close for a moment such as this. The river, Lark said. Go. Rook swung to look too, and in that swing Mirren saw what she needed to, surprise, real and ugly, and then a slick calculation sliding over it like fat hurrying to cover lean. The gate, she said to Cashin in her head as if he could hear her from Doc's table. You trusted me with it. I'm going. Caleb and Bren ran with her, not because she was Cashin's almost wife now but because she was a person sprinting toward the thing that could kill all the other things. Mrs. Avila yelled for Tomas to stay with Mr. Haskell. Mr. Haskell yelled at his hat. The dog, having committed to the morning, came too. They crested the slight rise at the edge of town and saw it, not the river out of its bed yet, but the bed arguing with itself in a new, angry language. The head gate sat wrong, its will turned too far, the notch ignored and abused. Water ran at the uprights with the momentum of rumor. Who touched it? Bren panted. Someone who didn't listen, Mirren said, and flung herself at the wheel. It didn't give. It laughed. It said you are small and I am water and this angle suits me fine. Wedge, she gasped. Caleb shoved a fence picket between spoke and post. The wheel bucked. Mirren felt the strain through her hands, into the ropes of her forearms, down into the place where a person's will lives when it is tired and still working. Give, she told it. Give like a mule gives when it decides you aren't lying. It gave. A quarter turn. Then another, horrible and delicious, as the gate lifted and the worst of the current was allowed to be a channel instead of a fist. Sandbag the south bank, she yelled at the men coming up behind, their faces a row of complicated belief. Not there, where the willow roots get stupid. Lark, take the second line to Mrs. Avila's fence. Haskell, you call the boys, make them runners not heroes. She didn't hear herself issue orders. The world had become one piece of iron in her hands and the decision under her palms. The key bit firm. The notch remembered her like a person remembers a name spoken right the first time. Good, Caleb grunted, sweat making tracks in the ash on his temple. Good. The gate climbed another inch. The river took a different breath. Mirren felt the change the way a seamstress feels when fabric stops fighting and agrees to be a dress instead of a rag. She dared to glance up. That's when she saw them, 3 men on the north bank where the fence gives way to rock and stinging nettle. 2 held poles like arguments. The third held a coil of wire in a box he treated like a baby he wanted to set down in the wrong cradle. Caleb, she said softly, and Caleb followed her eyes and swore. Is that? Blasting box, he finished. Wade used to use them for stumps. That one's new. Mirren's mouth went dry in a way that had nothing to do with smoke. They'll break the uprights, she said. They'll take the whole gate and send the river where it pleases. Toward town, Bren said, face gone gray. Toward the low street and docks. At Cashin, Mirren said, and found in herself a heat that was not anger but the clean opposite of it. No. Rook, someone shouted from down the slope. Mirren flinched as if the name had been a thrown rock. She turned and saw him on the road, hat low, mouth a scowl he thought was a plan. He was arguing with Haskell and losing. He was shouting at Lark and being ignored. He was, at last, seeing Mirren where she was, not as a problem to be talked past, but as the person with her hands on the thing that stood between his day and a truth he could not set on fire. Get off that wheel, he bellowed. No, she called back, and the river took the word and made it stronger. If you want it turned, come turn it and show the town the way you listen. He blanched, then spat, then made a chopping motion toward the north bank men that meant hurry. You can't hold the wheel and stop them both, Caleb said. No, Mirren said. You can. She shoved the key into his hands. You listen. When the wheel wants to jump, you ask it instead. She spun on her heel and ran down the riprap toward the nettles. Mirren. Bren shouted. Don't. She didn't hear. She was already on the slick rocks, balance leaning where Lark had once taught her to lean when carrying Stu through a crowded room, not away from weight but into it. The man with the blasting box looked up. He had a jaw built to be loyal to the wrong things. He sneered when he saw who came. Go home, he said. This is men's work. It is work, Mirren said, and took another step. You're just ashamed of the kind you're doing. He lifted the box as if to show her its credentials. You don't even know how this runs. Wire, she said. Charge. Thumb. Lie. He laughed. Lie? You called it stumping, she said. But you're aiming it at a town. He looked over her shoulder at Rook and saw no objection he respected. Stump's a stump, he said, and started to lower the charge into the cavity they had dug under the soaked uprights. Mirren threw the only thing she had, the brass buckle disc rescued from the ash, heavy, fused, perfect, a coin big enough to buy a second of time. It hit the man's wrist with a sound that was pure physics. He cursed and dropped the charge into water with no wire attached. Get her, one of the pole men growled, and came in swinging. Mirren ducked the first swing because all day and all the day before had been practice in moving when something mean moved. She put her shoulder into his center and thought fence post. He staggered, surprised to find his balance somewhere else. The second man grabbed her braid. She felt her scalp scream and knew later the pain would eat a small piece of dignity for supper. She pivoted the way Cashin had turned the head gate the night before, at the right angle, with respect for physics and the promise of patience, and the man found himself with a handful of hair in his feet, unsure of who their friends were. "Mirren!" Caleb shouted from the wheel. "2 more turns and she sings." "Good." She used the word as a nail and hung her next motion on it. She kicked the blasting box with the toe of her boot. It skittered toward the water. The wire man grabbed for it at the same time she did, and their hands collided in a handshake that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with whose day this would be. "Don't," she said through her teeth, and saw in his eyes for a split second a little boy who had picked up a frog and been told not to by someone kind who was ignored. He yanked. She let go. He fell backward. The box splashed into the river and swung away on its own coil like something that had decided to attend a different church. "Enough!" Rook roared from the road, red with the humiliation of a plan that hadn't loved him back. He raised his rifle to his shoulder and aimed not at the uprights now, not at Caleb, not at the men he'd brought, but at Mirren, because some men, when they can't command the river, will try to stop the person turning the wheel. "Don't," Lark said, and she didn't shout it. She placed the word into the morning as if she set a dish where it couldn't be knocked off the table. Rook fired. The shot tore the air beside Mirren's cheek and shaved a line through her sleeve. The world narrowed and widened at once. She felt suddenly easy in her bones. Fear had finished its say. She had chosen where to stand and there was nothing left to do but stand there. "Deputy." Doc Brennan's voice cracked through the river talk and the shouts like a gavel made of oak. "You fire again without a warrant into a crowd, you will stand trial with a jury of women whose children you almost drowned." The town heard that. Rook heard the town hearing that. He hesitated, the way all men hesitate for a breath when they see how their reflection has been written across the faces they thought were furniture. "Wheel!" Caleb cried, body shaking with effort and river and the argument of wood. "1 more." Mirren turned her back to Rook to do the more dangerous thing, trust. She put both palms to the spoke and leaned all the way in until her shoulders sang a litany of old work, mending, pulling calves, carrying pails, and at last the wheel gave the last full-throated groan and locked in the notch where it should have been when morning came. Water changed its mind. It slid, resentful but obedient, into the ditch that would carry it past the low street instead of into it. The head gate stood true. The uprights quivered and then remembered how to be themselves. Men gasped. Boys who had been trying to be men let themselves exhale like regular people. Mrs. Avila's voice broke into prayer never meant for church. Mr. Haskell took his hat off and held it to his chest like a flag. Mirren took her hands off the wheel and found she could not feel them. She did not fall. She stood and turned to the north bank to say something simple and final to the men who had come with their box. The man with the wire smiled a little, blood at the corner of his mouth, as if he had found a joke he might be allowed to tell later about being beaten by a buckle. Then his smile went odd and fixed. He looked down as if he had stepped somewhere he hadn't meant to. Mirren looked too. The coil they had wrestled hung off the bank now, and in the scramble another smaller box had slid from his jacket, bumping along the rock like a baby goat losing its feet. Its lid had popped, its fuse sat fat and smug, and the flame of Rook shot, skimming the rock, striking the dry tuft of grass by the charge, had found what it had been sent to find after all. "Back!" Mirren shouted, already moving to push Caleb from the wheel, to grab Bren's arm, to get Lark and Mrs. Avila down and the boys prone, and the dog turned into a different kind of brave. And the fuse, hissing like a snake who had learned to count, burned into the mouth of the buried charge and vanished. The river held its breath. So did the town. Even the sun seemed to step sideways and say, "I'll watch this one from over here." The blast came up from under the uprights like a decision made by a judge who didn't spend enough time in kitchens. Mud geysered. Wood sprang. The head gate shuddered and groaned and began, slowly, terribly, to tilt. "Hold it!" Caleb yelled, diving for the wheel. "Hold her!" Mirren didn't think. She leaped for the beam as it listed, grabbed splinters that bit her palms back into feeling, and hung her weight from the arm that wanted to lift and tear. "Rope!" Lark bellowed, voice bigger than law. "Haskell, rope!" Someone, everyone, threw lines. Bren looped one around the nearest upright and his own waist. The dog took a rope in his teeth and ran it down the bank like the best kind of idiot. Boys became men in a heartbeat and set their heels where the ground was least helpful and pulled anyway. Wood cried. Iron protested. The river, denied one victory, tried for another. Mirren felt her shoulder wrench and thought, absurdly, of Cashin's stitched one, and said out loud into the morning, "Not today." The beam held. It didn't so much return to true as decide for the time being not to become false. The ditch gulped the surge and spread it thin, and the town did not drown. Silence afterward had weight. Then it broke all at once into sound that was half sobbing and half cheering and some part hollering that had something in it like worship. Rook stood on the road with his rifle lowered and his face the color of paper that has lost its brags. His mouth opened. He chose no sentence because he couldn't find one that would keep its promise. "Deputy," Doc Brennan said, quietly now, because quiet carried better in this new kind of mourning, "you are relieved." Rook laughed once, sharp and high. "By who?" "By the town," Mrs. Avila said. "By anyone who can look water in the face and not lie." "By the court that is coming," Mr. Greeley added. "By the men you bribed who have already told me more than you wanted them to." Rook spat and turned as if to run toward the cottonwoods and the board that had not loved Mirren yesterday and would not love him today. He made it 3 strides. Caleb and Bren did not tackle him. They simply stepped in front of him and stood like walls that have forgotten how to move for people not worth the movement. "Home," Lark told the crowd at last. "You did a day's worth before breakfast. Go wash your faces. The judge will be here by sundown if Miss Page's wires fly faster than Rook can think." Miss Page, who had already begun writing again even as she cried and tried not to let anyone see, lifted her pencil in reply without looking up. Mirren sank onto a rock and let her hands find her own knees. They shook the way horses shake when the thunder passes. She pressed her palms flat and waited for them to remember the shape of calm. "You did that," Caleb said roughly, as if the words embarrassed him by taking the tone of a thank you. "We did it," Mirren said. "And if we don't want to do it again tomorrow, we'll write it down today." The day had other ideas about what would be written. They hadn't reached town when a rider pounded in from the west with his horse lathered and eyes bigger than a man who had only ridden fast. He slid off in front of Doc's office and staggered to the steps. "North Star," he gasped. "South Herd, cut fence, Raiders." "Who?" Lark demanded, sleeves already up, apron already tight. "Brand blinds," the man said. "Masks. Fast." They knew the low point on the fence. Mirren's mouth went clean with the taste of a different kind of fear. "Cashin," she said. "He can't ride." "He can't," Lark agreed, already moving. "But we can." "Caleb, Bren, saddles. Haskell, tell document Mrs. Avila, you own the town until I come back." "Gladly," Mrs. Avila said, and Mirren had never heard a word be so beautifully armed. Mirren ran. She didn't go to the porch to wait for a horse to be led. She went to the corral like she had always lived here and whistled once, short and certain. Finch came, ears up, eyes asking. She swung into the saddle with hands that had found feeling again and pointed him south. The fence line unspooled like thread pulled too hard from a shirt. At the low point where water sometimes pooled in spring, 6 posts lay like knocked teeth. Beyond, dust and motion and the kind of sound cattle make when men with bad timing make them think the world intends them harm. The raiders rode in a loose V, not drunk on speed but not sober either. One turned his masked face when he saw Mirren and the North Star hands crest the rise. He lifted his gun and fired into the air as if to make the cattle jump sideways into the gap they had made. Mirren watched his hand the way she watched men's eyes when they reached for her counter. Sloppy. Overconfident. Not born to cows. She didn't go for him. She went for the point, the one the herd followed without knowing they followed, and got there first. Finch saw what she asked and put his body exactly where the river of cows would take it into account. Easy, she told the lead cow. Pick a different river. Bren and Caleb hit the flank. Two of the bunkhouse kids who had grown 3 inches in courage this morning appeared on the far side and did not try to be heroes. They held and spoke and moved their horses as if they had been taught by someone who believed work could be kindness and still be work. The raiders did not like this. One charged Mirren because men who don't ride cattle often think the woman at point is a symbol instead of a person with a horse that knows how to step into a path and empty it. She let him come. At the last moment she knocked his hand with her rein end and Finch leaned into the shoulder of his mount, and the man found himself choosing between staying on his horse and staying angry. He chose horse. His mask slipped. She knew that mouth. Rook, she said, and the name didn't even surprise her. Of course he had friends who wore their faces when they committed crimes and covered them when the work required it. He saw the recognition. He saw her seeing the scar on his chin from a cat he'd once kicked and missed. She had bandaged that child's face when he was 16 and small with ambitions of being large, and she remembered how he had cried like a person and then scowled like a plan. He went for his gun the way a cornered boy does, fast and dumb. Mirren's stirrup iron took his wrist before the gun cleared leather. He swore and dropped it. His horse danced. The herd trembled. Bren whooped, not for show but for the way sound can push a wave of muscle a different way. Back, one of the masked men yelled at Rook. We're not paid for dying. Paid? Mirren said softly, but her voice carried along the edge of panic like the only solid thing. By who? She was asking the air in the river and the way money smells when the bag is opened. Rook didn't answer. He hauled his horse around and bolted for the cut fence. 3 of the raiders followed. 2 more tried to drive the herd through before the gap closed. Lark appeared at the low point with 3 more hands and a line of rope held by men who had learned today how to become walls. The herd, seeing no more through, decided not to learn panic as a second language. It was messy and then it wasn't. Dust settled. Cattle blew and blinked and turned their minds to grass the way grateful people do when catastrophe is postponed rather than ended. Mirren wiped her forearm across her face and left a long gray smear that felt like a stripe she had earned. We need to set men at the fence, Caleb said, breathing hard. Day and night. Not men, Lark corrected, eyes on the line of cottonwoods where danger likes to pretend to be shade. People. Women don't look away when they braid, and this is braiding work, patience, pattern, strength when your hands get numb. Mirren tightened the last tie on a temporary post and felt a heat slide under her skin that was not anger and not fear and not the pride she didn't trust. It felt like belief. Not in destiny, not in men who ride in and fix things, not in paper by itself. In torque and will and the way a head gate obeys a person who learned to listen with their hands. Back to town, she said. We make the case now, while the sweat is still honest. Judge Calder arrived at sundown with dust to his collar and a Bible in his saddlebag, not because he meant to thump it, but because he liked how onions didn't rot when wrapped in its pages when you were on the trail. He shook hands like a man who had counted too many knuckles to look only at the rings and the dirt under nails. He listened. He listened to Miss Page's wires. He listened to Mr. Greeley's notes. He listened to Mrs. Avila's smoke and Tomas's wire loop and Mr. Haskell's sorrow that he hadn't moved faster. He listened to Lark's memory of a false wall and the list of false donations and the way real ones were smaller and mattered more. He listened to Mirren tell the Headgate story. She didn't embellish. She told it like a ledger, items and amounts and the exact names of people who stood their bodies where water needed their bodies to be. Then he listened to Rook. Rook told a good story. Men like him often do. He spoke of lamp oil and carelessness. He spoke of a headgate turned too far by amateurs who wanted to play at ranching. He spoke of raiders unrelated to him who liked chaos and saw an opening. He said coincidence in the way bad men ask that word to sit in a chair too small for it. Judge Calder did not blink often. When he did, it meant he was labeling something in his filing system with a tag he would remember later. He blinked twice at coincidence. Deputy, he said at last, voice even. Bring me your purchase records for ammunition and kerosene for the last 30 days. Bring me your patrol log and your list of paid informants. Bring me the deeds you pledged at the bank as collateral to buy your new roof. His eyes slid to Tolland. Bring me the bank's copies. If any slip of paper comes up missing, I will assume it was because it sang and didn't want to sing anymore. Tolland bristled. This is irregular. So is arson, Calder said mildly. So is a river when it visits the low street without invitation. So is a ledger that pretends numbers are weeds. He set the hearing for morning because men who like the dark do worse in light, and he wanted the light fresh. Mirren walked out of the church hall where the judge had set his makeshift desk and felt the day collecting itself for a last argument. Cashin stood on the steps, pale, steady, shirt clean but bandage peeking at the edge. Doc had tied him to the table, Cashin had untied himself, and everyone in the arrangement understood the choreography. You should be in bed, Mirren said, and went to him with a relief that made her knees foolish. I tried that, he said. Bed seemed sad without my fiancée in it. His attempt at lightness lasted one heartbeat. Then he saw her hands, bandaged hastily where splinters had made their small signatures. He took them as if they were a book he meant to read slowly. You did work today I didn't deserve. That's a poor way to talk about your partner, she said, and leaned her forehead to his for a moment that let the world be far. He swallowed. I keep wanting to say sorry for your shop. But I think you'll make a better one and be more dangerous in it. I will, she said simply. But first we make this town honest. They started down the steps together. The square was heavy with watching. Rook moved on the edge like a man who had slept in a borrowed coat and couldn't find his own. Tolland flanked him with the air of a man who thinks money will stand in front of him and get sorry on his behalf. Stay close to Doc's, Lark murmured, easing to their side like a shadow you'd be lucky to cast. Men like those don't go to sleep when a judge says a time. Mirren nodded. The river talked behind her shoulder like a thing that would keep talking no matter what the town decided about itself. She let the sound settle her spine. They were halfway across the street when the boy from the Telegraph, Miss Page's nephew, quick and earnest, came pelting across the square with an envelope lifted like a flag. Judge, he yelled. Wire from Dry Wells, urgent. Calder, still on the church steps, took the paper and read. His mouth went a shape Mirren did not like. What? Lark called, because she had no patience for men who made faces instead of sentences. Calder looked up. Marshal coming from the county seat at dawn, he said. Says he has an arrest order for Cashin North on suspicion of embezzlement and fraud relating to water rights acquisitions. He looked at Tolland without looking away. Signed 3 days ago. Cashin's hand tightened on Mirren's. The town turned its head like a flock that has just realized the hawk it had been watching isn't the only one in the sky. Paper, Tolland said, smoothing his lapel with a finger like a caress. Sometimes it arrives on time. No, Mirren said, heat and calm sliding together until they felt like the same thing. Sometimes it is sent early by a man who knew he would need cover. She looked at Cashin. We will answer it. He nodded once. With all the ledgers, he said. Tomorrow morning, Judge Calder said, voice even and unafraid and suddenly a shade harder. We begin with the town's case. Then I will see your marshal's paper. If he wants to arrest a man who just kept a river from visiting his neighbor's kitchens, he can do it in a room where the town is standing up. Mirren lifted her chin. The square, which had so often felt like a measuring cup men poured at her, now felt like a floor where feet could stand without apology. She walked Cashin toward Doc's light, each step the exact size of a thing you can do right now. They did not see the figures slip into the shadow between Tolland's office and the bakery. They did not see the small bag in that figure's hand. They did not see the way the figure's head lifted, waiting for the wind to shift before striking a match. But the dog did, ears pricking, body stiff with the alertness animals offer as tribute when they love the people who gave them a job. He growled low. Lark's head turned. Mirren's followed. In the thin, last light of evening, a flame kissed a fuse with the casualness of men who think they have time for all their sins, and the small bag tucked into the foundation records outside Talon's office began to whisper its secret. Mirren ran. She didn't shout fire because sometimes a town needs one clean word instead of a scream. Paper, she yelled, and the match in the shadow flared brighter, and the fuse ran, and the building that held the evidence the judge needed to see exhaled once before deciding whether to burn. Burn. The whisper became a darting blue tongue in the crack, and Mirren hit the stoop at a dead run with the dog ahead of her like a small loud miracle. She didn't scream fire. She didn't give panic the word it wanted. She grabbed the water barrel by the steps and heaved, sloshing half of it across the ledger chest that sat under the window where Talon liked to show the town's generosity vouchers in a neat stack. The water hissed. The flame fought like a thing insulted. Lark slammed into view with a wet sack, smacked the fuse line flat, and ground it under her heel until it squealed out. The dog dove into the shadows with a snarl and came out dragging a wrist, not by biting flesh but by worrying the cuff enough to trip the man attached to it. Hold, Mirren barked, voice cut to a single command. Caleb landed like a door and pinned the figure with his knee. The man bucked once and then went loose, not the loose of surrender but the loose of a plan collapsing under its own story. Lantern, Lark panted. Miss Page thrust one into her hand. Mirren crouched, the world narrowed to the tight circle of light and the man's face in it. The clerk from the bank. The one who had looked sick when Lark walked around the counter this morning and sicker when the hidden wall confessed. Abel, Lark said, not unkindly. His eyes skittered in the light. He said he'd cancel the note, he whispered, as if the word cancel might draw forgiveness to itself. Said Mama could keep her house. Rook said he'd help if I, he swallowed, and there was a kind of grief in his throat honest enough to earn listening. I thought just the edges. Just the foundation records on the outside. I didn't think about the way paper smolders up under boards. Rook said, Mirren repeated, because the words needed to be held up where the town could see them. He sent you. Abel nodded once. He looked at her hands and winced as if the bandages stung his own palms. I thought you were just mean to him, he said to Mirren in a small, cracked boy voice. With your mouth. But you were only true. Only, Lark said, dry. We'll put the only in the ledger. Mr. Greeley? The notary had arrived at a trot and now stood at the bottom of the steps, seal in his hand like a small benign weapon. I'll stamp your statement. He looked at Abel. There's a chair in Doc's office that helps men sit up while they tell the truth. We'll go there. After this, Mirren said, and lifted the charred lid of the chest with a cloth. The top layer had blackened. The next had curled. Below, the writing lived. She exhaled after holding her breath for a selfish beat and felt her knees try treachery. Lark took the weight of the lid with her hip. Good, she said, and the word counted heads and found them all present. Miss Page, stack what you can carry. Haskell, take copies and hold them with those card hands you swear aren't steady. Mr. Haskell's mouth trembled. I'll be steadier than God, he said, shocking himself and Lark both with the audacity of it, and then he blushed and added, no offense. None taken, old man, Lark said. He's got thicker skin than we do. Mirren watched the water snake under the boards and thought of the river's language and the false one man had tried to teach it this morning. Lark's wet sack steamed. The dog lay panting with his chin on his paws, eyes on the alley where the match had come from. The square exhaled and inhaled again, as if it had been holding someone else's breath and finally found its own. Enough for tonight, Judge Calder said from the steps, having come as soon as the boy with the wire hollered on the church corner. We put the town to bed 1 hour before dawn or it won't wake up straight. Mr. Greeley, Doc's office. Abel, you walk between the dog and me and it'll keep your ankles honest. Miss Page, double stamp everything in your way. Lark, he stopped, considered, then smiled at her as if she'd done him a favor he hadn't known he'd needed. Deputy Lark, if you please, hold the night. Deputy? Rook bristled from his spot under the cottonwoods, his rifle slung like a sulk. Judge Calder didn't raise his voice. You'll have your say in the morning, Deputy Rook. Right now, the town requires a peace officer who smells like smoke for the right reasons. A sound moved through the crowd that wasn't laughter but had laughter's clean spine. Rook's mouth worked, then closed around a bitterness that looked like old pennies. He turned away. He was not good at turning away. He made it uglier than it needed to be. Mirren rose, blood ringing in her ears like the bell that had started this monstrous day. Cashin, pale but upright, had made it to the edge of the light with Doc's hand like a leash on his sleeve. "You weren't in that building," she told him, and only later realized the words were not a question but a breathless inventory. "I'm not smart enough to be everywhere in one night," he said. His voice was thin but clean. "I saw you run. You'll see me run again," she said. "Tomorrow. To papers and to a bench and then home." He smiled with his eyes. "Home," he echoed, and it felt like a word that stood up by itself even if the walls were new and the roof imagined. Dawn broke into the square like a court clerk, pale, exact, uninterested in anyone's pride. The church hall served as court. Men sat on benches they used for hymn singing. Women stood along the walls because when you stand you can tip a whole room by leaning. Children were kept out, made to carry messages back and forth and therefore convinced they were part of the machinery of justice. Judge Calder rapped a spoon against the table. "We'll start with the town's case." He nodded to Mr. Greeley, who rose like a piece of paper held up to a good lamp and began to read. He read the tin box receipts, kerosene, fuses, blasting caps, from Weller's, the stamps so plain even Talon couldn't mistake it for a forgery. He read the names in the second ledger, the widow's fund diversions, the interest made to grow like mold in a root cellar. He read the stipend payments to Deputy Rook, not for patrol but for maintenance, a word that did not look like law when you watched it too long. Miss Page called the Times. She read the wire logs to and from dry wells. She added the midnight message sent on Talon's private account, something she had noticed because she noticed everything, that went out the evening the board failed Mirren and came back with the marshal and the words embezzlement and fraud attached to Cashin's name in an ink that smelled like fear mixed with hope. Abel spoke. He didn't try to make himself good. He tried to tell the truth. He told about the match, about the promise made in Rook's small office, about the way a man looks at you when he believes he can buy your conscience and your mother's mortgage in the same afternoon. Mrs. Avila spoke. She spoke like a field you plant if you expect to eat. She said the smoke came first and then Rook's inspection and then the smell that wasn't lamp oil. She said Tomas had nightmares about wire now, and if the town wanted a different story, they could make it with their hands today, or they could read this one to their children until the children learned to sleep scared. Talon said obstruction again and found it worked less well in daylight. Rook played with his toothpick and tried to look bored. The way he shifted his weight sang a note Mirren recognized, cornered creature trying to pretend the corner was a choice. "Deputy," Calder said at last, "you will hand your badge to Miss Lark." Rook half laughed and did not move. Caleb and Bren did, not touching him, just standing in the space where he would have liked to throw his shoulders. Rook's eyes flicked to the doors, to the windows, to the faces he'd been able to turn for years with a tone of voice and a badge pin. They didn't turn. He pulled the pin. It scraped his shirt on the way out like a conscience taking a souvenir and dropped it on the table as if he wanted the sound to mock the room. "Abel," Judge Calder said. "You'll be charged for your part. We'll say it out loud and we won't make it heavier to make ourselves look righteous. You'll also be granted consideration for the way you stopped the match and spoke here. Your mother's note will be handled in the open. Talon, your books are impounded as of yesterday. Miss Page and Mr. Greeley will copy what needs copying and send to the county seat. You will not leave town." Talon pressed his lips into a look of a strict uncle. "On what authority?" "On the authority of a town not drowning," Calder replied. "Please don't make me dress it up for you." The door blew open on a gust of dust and batch. The marshal from the county seat stepped in with a paper in his hand and a look that made people sit up straight even if their spine didn't need the help. "Core of Prospect Hollow," he said, which was not a question except to men who needed to remind everyone they owned ink. "It is," Judge Calder said. "Marshal, welcome. Have you eaten?" The marshal blinked. Not yet. Then you'll arrest after breakfast, Lark said from the wall. Men think better when they've chewed something honest. The marshal looked baffled and then amused despite himself. I've got a writ, he said, lifting the paper as if to say this is what passes for hunger where I come from, Cashin North. Embezzlement and fraud in the matter of water rights. Cashin stood. Mirren stood a half step forward without deciding to. The room went tight around the marshal's boots in a way a river wraps a stone. It intends to teach patience. You have a piece of paper, Mirren said. We have several. She didn't raise her voice. She let the copies speak, ledgers signed in clean hands, contracts stamped, the notary's seal on the agreement that made the headgate half hers now because they had written it yesterday not knowing they would need it today. She slid Miss Page's wire log across the table. She slid Tolland's copy of the late-night telegram in, its numbers twin to the one in Miss Page's book. Who filed your writ? Judge Calder asked the marshal. County Treasurer, he replied. On petition by local bankers seeking redress for misappropriated funds dispersals to, he checked the line, widow and child sustenance accounts not sanctioned by the lending institution. He looked up. That you, Tolland? Tolland smiled the way men smile when they find they prefer to be obvious. Protecting the town's capital. You sent this before you set your man to burn the evidence that would exonerate the man you wanted to arrest, Lark said. Awful messy, Tolland. You usually spill your soup more gracefully. Allegations, Tolland hissed. Allegations that leave tracks, Miss Page said, tapping the wires. The marshal scratched his jaw. Judge? This town has demonstrated immediate cause to believe the charges against North were cooked to order to cover another crime, Calder said. You can sit and hear the rest or take a man into custody in front of the people who pulled the headgate will this morning and see how friendly your coffee tastes after. The marshal did something Mirren would remember to like him for. He folded his writ and put it in his breast pocket. I'll hear, he said. I've got a horse that needs watering anyway. They heard. They heard for 2 hours. They heard until the room smelled like paper and sweat and people being brave. Then the marshal stood and said, I'll be paying a call on the county treasurer when I get home. Mr. Tolland, I'd advise you to come with me peaceable. Tolland went gray like unbaked dough. You've no. The marshal raised an eyebrow. I've got a suspicion in 2 wrists. He looked at Rook. You can come too. Plenty of bunks. Rook laughed, foolish and high. You think one day makes a town forget who runs it? He pivoted to the door as if to prove his point with speed. He never reached it. Mrs. Avila, who had sluiced water and hauled children and baked bread at midnight and watched her boys sleep for 12 minutes between all of it, stuck out her broom. Not hard. Just with the care of a woman who knows where to put a handle. Rook's toe caught. He stumbled. Caleb's hand found the back of his collar. Bren took his other elbow because he had an old shoulder and likely to dislocate it in the struggle, and men like Bren think ahead about the work they don't want to give a doctor later. He was cuffed without violence. The sound the cuffs made was not a clank like a show in a saloon. It was a click like a not finishing. Court will recess, Judge Calder said, sounding like a door shutting. Lark, take the badge for now and pin it to your apron if you must. Mrs. Avila, you're head of the committee that will see to the fence until we get more posts than courage. Mr. Greeley, you'll sit with Miss Page and turn this day into a record. Caleb and Bren, ride with the marshal. If anyone thinks to make this foolish, let them mistake your patience for permission. People breathe the way they do when the air remembers its purpose. The room stretched. Children peered in, squints of hope already forming because children are good at survival plans that include cookies. Mirren found Cashin's hand. He looked at her like the person at the end of a day who cannot believe they get to start a new one. This was the hard part, he said softly. We still have to live it. I want the living, she said. The daily kind with ledgers and fence mending. With whatever comes when a big man thinks a town is small. What comes next, Lark said, overhearing and unapologetic, is food. What comes next, after that, Miss Page added, glancing at the window where the river showed a clean shoulder, is rebuilding. What comes next after, Mrs. Avila said, and winked the way angels probably wink when they tie on aprons, is a wedding. They married on the porch because the porch had held the most of them this week. Doc Brennan read words that sounded like contracts and blessings at the same time. Lark stood with her hands on her hips like both witness and enforcer. Mr. Greeley wrote their names as if he were writing the proper labels on the world. Miss Page made the telegraph click once, quiet, like a toast sent down the wire. Mirren wore her work skirt because that was the only one that understood her stride. Cashin wore his clean shirt and the bandage he refused to take off until Doc said so. Finch snorted approval from the rail as if horses believe in paper when it's honest. The dog lay on Mirren's boot and pretended this was his job now and always had been. They signed the paper they had already signed, not because it needed more signatures but because it needed the ceremony of doing it while people watched and breathed easier. "Do you promise to disagree and not leave the table?" Doc asked, and Mirren almost laughed because he had stolen the line from Cashin and improved it. "I do," Cashin said. "Do you promise to mark your losses and not hide them until they ruin supper?" Doc asked Mirren, and she felt her father's shadow try to stand up and then sit back down in the place she had made for it. "I do," she said, and meant all of it and knew that meaning is a renewable resource you still have to protect. They kissed, but it was not for show. It had the clean, almost shy sound of two people agreeing to try the slow parts with as much courage as they had given the loud parts. After, they ate on the steps. Beans and cornbread again, because you don't let a lucky menu wander. Mrs. Avila delivered a cake shaped vaguely like a fence post and nobody pretended it was elegant. Lark clinked her spoon against a cup and said, "You'll both be at the head gate at dawn tomorrow," and everyone laughed because of course that was a blessing here. Mirren slipped away for a breath and walked to the edge of the yard where the map of the range on the horizon stood up true and humble. She let the wind lift sweat from her neck. She leaned her forehead against the post where her new house would want a corner and spoke to herself the way you speak to a horse you love and a river you intend to help carry the town. "Home," she said again, and it rang like a nail properly set. Cashin found her. He didn't ask what she'd said. He wasn't that kind of man. He put his hand on the post where hers had been and stood with her and looked where she looked. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. They didn't get to keep their quiet long. A rider pounded up from the east where the flats pretend to be harmless. He slid to a stop, breathless, dust mixing with wedding sugar on the air. "North Star," he gasped. Message from the county works office, riders posted notices up and down the river. Canal Consortium, eminent domain, head gate seizure at sunup if not contested. Lark swore the word she saved for men who confused paper for God. "They're fast." "They're frightened," Miss Page said, already reaching for pencil and wire. "Fright makes men right." Mirren did not feel the world lurch. She felt it line up again, a new notch in the wheel she had learned to turn yesterday and today. She took Cashin's hand and squeezed once hard enough to speak in bones. "We'll be there," she said. "With paper and with people." He nodded, not with bravado but with the kind of yes you say when you don't know if you'll win and you're already returning your chair to the table to sit for the long talk. The town straightened itself like a dress put on in better light. Mr. Haskell had his hat in his hands and didn't look for a new one because his head and this hat had been through enough together already. Mrs. Avila told Tomas to fetch the good broom. Caleb and Bren checked the cinches on horses that would forget fatigue if asked politely. Lark tied her apron tighter and made the badge sit crooked because it didn't deserve center stage. Mirren lifted her chin and looked down the road to the place where men would come with rolled maps and rolled words and try to flatten a river while standing in a town that had learned this week how to stand up. She smiled without sweetness. "Let them bring their paper," she said, and the wind took the sentence and stored it where the ditch curves and the willow listens. "We'll bring ours." She reached for Cashin's hand again. He gave it. The sound of the river slid around them like an old friend clearing its throat. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.